Go to 18 cities, 11 states in 7 days with Brother Tavis on the poverty tour that he came up with and his team facilitated. And we were able to see the middle class brothers and sisters of all colors, all cultures, all civilizations and sexual orientations, because they were also immigrants with our brown brothers and sisters. They were black, they were brown, they were white. We started on the Indian reservation because it's always fascinating to look at America through the lens of the original peoples. It's a very important starting point. The original people. And we began with the notion that poor people are priceless and precious, just as each individual has a dignity that ought to be affirmed. And what did we see, Brother Tavis? We saw the results of a system in place that has been driven by corporate greed at the top, with oligarchs ruling and politicians rotating, with money coming from the big banks, big corporations, pushing working people to the margins and rendering poor people superfluous, which is to say either unnecessary or, in the great metaphor of Ralph Ellison, invisible. So anytime you talk about poor people, you got to talk about the larger systemic context. How could it be that the top 400 individuals have wealth equivalent to the bottom 150 million fellow citizens? There's something sick about that. They say, oh, they deserve it, they're so smart. No, I know some smart folk broke as the Ten Commandments financially. They just can't get a job. They just can't get a job. If 1% of the population owns 41% of the wealth, and yet, what is it now, 56% of our precious children of all colors live in or near poverty, the kind of thing Marian Wright Edelman's been talking about? Something is deeply wrong, it's morally obscene. Then how could it be that poverty hasn't become the major moral and spiritual issue of our time? Because our leaders lack courage and independence. They're too tied to big money. How could it be that the prison industrial complex has been expanding and $300 billion has gone into jails and prisons and the criminal justice system, and yet when it comes to money for schools, money for housing, money for jobs with a living wage, it's a warped system. We're here because Martin Luther King Jr. and others said America is a sick society. America doesn't always have to be sick. If Americans rise up the way the Occupy movement has been talking about and begin to talk about these issues seriously. And that's why this issue of poverty as it affects the middle class is now declining. Because if it was just a matter of black, brown, and red, we'd be voices in the wilderness. Because as long as there's a black face or a brown face on poverty, we overlook it. I'm saying, looking at Terry Reid and Bishop Staples and Dick Gregory right now, they know what I'm talking about. As long as there's a brown face, we overlook it. White middle class face, we got a problem now. We're going to have to deal with something. And that's fine, because we believe that white brothers and sisters have the same value as red and brown and black and yellow. And this moment, that's why I'm so excited about the manifesto that we wrote, brother. And we had a good time writing that thing.
And it's what your definition of an intellectual, and I said before we began, I would like to know which tenure committee in the American educational system is going to embrace this.
I've never given a damn about tenure other than getting the position to take care of my family. But if I've got to get tenure and can't tell the truth, tenure can kiss my black behind. But go right ahead.
The vocation of the intellectual, this is Dr. West, is to let suffering speak, let victims be visible, and let social misery be put on the agenda of those in power. And second, that moral action is based on a broad, robust propheticism that highlights systemic social analysis of the circumstances under which tragic persons struggle. So talk about that, because we have seen such a corruption, not just of the black intellectual class, but the white intellectual class. They have sold themselves to a neoliberal agenda, which is promoted widely within academia. Many of these elite colleges and universities are virtually corporations themselves. Talk about that concept of the organic intellectual and what's taken place.
Well, one is you had to keep track of what the prophetic intellectuals are up against. Massive commodification, big money, big banks, big corporations trying to incorporate black voices, white voices, brown voices, intellectuals, academics, to, in many ways, keep them distant from a prophetic tradition that will bring critique to bear, not just in a narrow talk about discrimination, not just in a narrow talk about liberal reform, but of a highly financialized monopoly capitalist system which is global, in which, as we see in Greece, the big banks dictate and the poor people suffer.
Right.
Same is true in Latin America, same is true in the United States with Wall Street.
Yeah, I hope you all noticed the tears in Sister Vicky's eyes at the very end of her presentation. And the tears have to do with somebody who cares. The tears have to do with recognizing the condition of poor people in America is a matter of national security, like Iraq, like Afghanistan, like whatever foreign policy that we know. And part of the problem in America is we don't have elected leaders who understand the tears.
Before you go further, I want to jump in right quick.
Yes.
When you say that poverty is an issue of national security,
National security.
Make the case for me.
Namely, that if we don't come to terms with it, then it's not the external threat, it's the internal rot that's going to lead toward a collapse of American democracy into an oligarchy, a plutocracy, where the well-to-do live in gated spaces and working people and poor people are at each other's throats, and America goes under as we know it. That's important. Am I right about your tears?
You're right.
And I feel that. And one of the reasons why we don't have the leadership among the 536 is that they are leading. They're just not leading in such a way that they make poor and working people a priority. When investment bankers are in trouble, they lead. They solve that problem. Here's big trillions of dollars. When the banking system's in problem, they lead. Action right away. When you need to go to war, action right away. How you going to pay for it? We'll deal with it down the line. Oh, you're not going to pay for it, huh? No. That certain kind of leadership is called myopic, short-sighted, narrow, and in the end, it leads toward catastrophe. What we need is courageous, progressive, prophetic leadership. And the truth is this, that historically in America, it's been primarily the black prophetic tradition that provided that leadership, precisely because you had a peoples enslaved, Jim Crow, on intimate terms with terror, trauma, and stigma, but still taught the country how to love. Taught the country how to love. Justice is what love looks like in public. It has been the Frederick Douglasses and the Martin Kings and the Fannie Lou Hamers and the Ida B. Wells and the Dorothy Irene Height who taught us about justice, who taught us about love. And right now, the black prophetic tradition is very weak and feeble. Now, the black prophetic tradition has been the leaven in the American democratic loaf. And you don't have to be black to be part of that tradition. You have to be connected with that tradition and choose to be a part of it. Miles Horton chose, John Brown chose, Barbara Ehrenreich chooses. It's not a matter of stereotype. You're part of a tradition that has taught America the best about itself, of how to love others even when you're hated, to talk about justice even when revenge is coming at you. That is spiritual. That is moral. It's not just a political question. And we got 536 leaders in Washington that are so obsessed with power, 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 money, money, money. How they going to get the lobbyists satisfied? Where they going to get money for the next re-election? That when it comes to moral and spiritual issues like the condition of our precious children of all colors, it's an afterthought. And they talk about it during the election. And then as soon as they're elected, they back to business as usual. And we're going to go under.
I want to.
So it's so brilliant what you just said.
So
bear witness today that we know the relation between corporate greed and what goes on too often in the Supreme Court decision. We want to send a lesson to ourselves, to our loved ones, our families, our communities, our nation, and the world, that out of deep love for working and poor people, that we are willing to put whatever it takes, even if we get arrested today, and say, we will not allow this day of Martin Luther King Jr.'s memorial to go without somebody going to jail. Because Martin King would be here right with us, willing to throw down out of deep love. And I want to add a special word for our brothers and sisters of the police force, because we want to let them know that we are standing with them as working people as well.
We're here to bear witness with the be in solidarity with the Occupy movement all around the world, because we love poor people, we love working people, and we want Martin Luther King Jr. to smile from the grave that we haven't forgotten.
Perfect.
Now, and so we've got to keep our focus on the system, and we got to keep our focus on bodies, mind, hearts, and souls who have courage, vision, come together, organize, mobilize, because in the end, and this is where the legacy of Martin King becomes indispensable, that in the end it's not about one person or one president. It is about a fundamental transformation. We need a transfer of power from unaccountable oligarchs and plutocrats to those Sly Stone called everyday people. That's what we're talking about. And that means every color, every religion, every non-religion. We're talking about, are you concerned enough about the future that you're willing to take a risk, pay a cost, live, and maybe die? And that is the challenge, you see, because I'll tell you my first prayer when I think of Brother Barack Obama. You know what my first prayer is? I pray for the safety of his family, his precious two little ones, and wife. How come? Because white supremacy on the right wing of side is real. It's very real. And those of us who have lived under those kind of threats for 30 years know exactly what we're talking about. I'm looking again at Dick Gregory. Most of your friends are dead. How come they're dead? Because they love so much. They're willing to sacrifice. That's why Martin is gone. And most people don't want to die. They'd rather sell out than die. They'd rather sell out than die. But what we're talking about is not just one individual. We're talking about what kind of people we are. And if we don't have enough ordinary citizens of all colors to fight for your democracy here, just like you fight for it in Afghanistan under leadership formulations, then we're going to lose the democracy and poor people will still be caught. That's the challenge, it seems to me. That's a major challenge. That's the third moment in American history. Our first moment was against British monarchy. People were willing to fight, and they pushed out the imperialists. And the second was against slavery. They were willing to fight. They pushed out slavery. And Jim Crow was just another form of slavery, just like the new Jim Crow or prison industrial complex is just another form of slavery. And now the challenge in America is oligarchy. That's the challenge. And we have to have leadership that says we love oligarchs, we hate oligarchy. Because oligarchs are human beings who make choices and they can change their minds.
Right.
That's true. Just like white folk could choose to be white supremacists or they could fight white supremacy. You have to make a choice.
We stand here in front of the police department to say, in the spirit of love, we don't hate anybody. But we love young people of all colors.
You know, we moved from a stage of monopoly industrial capitalism to monopoly finance capitalism, so that 40 years ago, the banks only had 9 or 10% of the corporate profits in the whole economy. Today, they have 43% of the corporate profits. And when you have banks that are not primarily interested in lending anymore, but rather trading on casino-like operations in which they make big money, but they don't produce any product. They're making billions of dollars. When the General Motors were making big money, they were producing product and they were providing jobs. Nowadays, it's speculative. That's what finance capitalism is globally. And we have to be honest about that and then say we've got to be practical in terms of how we're going to be able to preserve our dignity, integrity, organizing, mobilizing programs that help people. But you have to also tell people the very, very painful truth of the kind of system that we are living in. And unfortunately, it's very rare that they even get a chance to hear these kinds of truths about the kind of capitalism. People debating about Bain. Bain is the peak of an iceberg. Predatory capitalism has been at work for the last 30 years across the board in significant ways. Bain is not some isolated unit tied to private equity. This thing has been happening across the board. That's why trade unions pushed against their backs pushed against the wall. And so in that sense, it does look rather bleak at times, but this is another reason why the black prophetic tradition is important. If you've been under slavery for 244 years, it looks kind of bleak. But here comes Harriet Tubman anyway. Here come the spirituals anyway. If you've been Jim Crow for over 100 years in the land of liberty, it looks bleak. But here come the blues and John Coltrane and Sarah Vaughan and Martin King and A. Philip Randolph to say, you know what? We're going to teach you how to love and struggle for justice with your head high in the midst of darkness.
So your response to the election of Donald Trump and now the cabinet he is appointing around him?
Well, I think he's already betrayed working people in terms of making sure, in his view, that Wall Street is in the driver's seat. And what I mean by that is that in an emerging neo-fascist moment, you have the rule of big business, which is big banks and big corporations. You scapegoat the most vulnerable. It could be Muslims, Mexicans, gay brothers, lesbians, sisters, indigenous peoples, black people, Jews, and so on. And then you also have militaristic orientations around the world. And so you see the extension of the repressive apparatus as those of us who hit the streets, those of us who have been willing to go to jail, we've had to recognize we'll have more coming at us under Trump administration. But the crucial thing is that he had talked about his connection with working people, and it's clear that the 1% are still running things.
Virginia and you in Georgia, you go crazy or you get some spiritual fortitude. It was also a crime to hope. We couldn't worship God without white supervision, so you stole away at night in the creek and you held hands in a ring shout and you raised your voice and you lifted your voice and sang a spiritual. That was a crime in the land of religious liberty. So that no matter how dark it is, even in the present, it's hard to conceive of what my great-great-great-grandmother and great-great-great-grandfather had to wrestle with in the abyss of American slavery. I can't conceive of it even being worse, as bad as it is, but with this proviso. And this is where I want to say zero on young folk, because I spend a lot of time with young people. I learn a lot from young people. I see the Cornel West Theory right here, one of the grand hip-hop group here in Washington, D.C., around the country. And they're kind enough to name it after me and get in trouble, but I appreciate that. But I say this about young folk in a critical way, that I do not know of a wave of young people who are commensurate to the grandmothers and grandfathers and those ancestors that shaped me in terms of who I am. I just don't. And the reason is because young people have been so penetrated with a capitalist culture and the culture of superficial spectacle and instant gratification and overnight success and push button getting over. So in that sense, there's a shift from the John Coltrane's and the Sarah Vaughns and the Curtis Mayfields and the Ray Charles and the Aretha Franklins into the bubblegum music that's too dominant. There's a shift. Now, we got a number of prophetic folk, but that is a shift. So when we talk about the young people who are to help make this fundamental social change, if you're not talking about courage, integrity, and willingness to serve and sacrifice, then you're going to get bought out. You're going to sell out quick. You're not going to be a long-distance runner. You're going to be so obsessed with instant success and superficial status that you're going to make your grandmama weak from the grave. Because she wanted you to have earned greatness, not quick success. She wanted to measure it by the love in your heart and the service that you rendered, not what your position is and how big your crib is. That's a very different sensibility. And that's a tradition we got to keep. We got to fight for that. We got to keep it alive. And of course, it's at work with what Brother Ross is talking about, because I think we agreeing. Is that right, though, Brother?
You've also said, Dr. West, you just said that his administration will be neo-fascist. Could you explain, what do you mean by that? Neo-fascist as opposed to fascist, and what the two mean?
Well, neo-fascist it's an American-style form of fascism, and what I mean by that is we've had a neoliberal rule from Carter to Obama. That neoliberal rule left in place a national security state. It left in place massive surveillance. It left in place the ability of the president to kill an American citizen with no due process. That's Obama. That was the culmination of the neoliberal era. Now you get someone who's narcissistic, which is to say, out of control psychologically, who is ideologically confused, which is to say, in over his head. And who does he choose? The most right-wing reactionary zealots, which lead toward the arbitrary deployment of law, which is what neo-fascism is, but to reinforce corporate interests, big bank interests, and to keep track of those of us who are cast as other. Peoples of color, women, Jews, Arabs, Muslims, Mexicans, and so forth and so on. So this is one of the most frightening moments in the history of this very fragile empire and fragile republic.
So I want to talk about some of the picks of Donald Trump, like, President-elect Donald Trump's Treasury Secretary, Steven Mnuchin. Deep ties to Wall Street, including working as a partner for Goldman Sachs, where his father also worked. Mnuchin's hedge fund also played a role in the housing crisis after it scooped up the failing California bank IndyMac in 2008. Under Mnuchin's ownership, IndyMac foreclosed on 36,000 families, particularly elderly residents trapped in reverse mortgages. People would go to Mnuchin's home to protest outside as they were foreclosed out of their own homes. Mnuchin was accused of running a foreclosure machine. The bank, which was renamed One West, was also accused of racially discriminatory lending practices. In 2015, Mnuchin sold the bank for $3.4 billion, $1.8 billion more than he bought it for.
This is what you call spiritual blackout. There's a level of callousness. There's a level of indifference toward poor and working people, preoccupation with greed, and most importantly, lack of accountability, doing anything they can do unless in the end they get caught by the law. And of course, oftentimes they've already disproportionately influenced those who apply the law, those who are supposed to be regulating them. And so this is another instance of Wall Street run amok. I mean, I and some of us were very critical to Adolph Reeds and others, very critical of Geithner, Summers, the Rubin crowd, straight out of Wall Street when Brother Barack Obama moved into the White House.
Summers, who you know well because he was president of Harvard when you were a professor
Absolutely.
there, and gotten a bit of an altercation with him.
Bless his soul. But so that you can see under the neoliberal rule, Wall Street's still in the driver's seat. We were hoping with Brother Bernie Sanders that we could bring the neoliberal era to a close. And by neoliberal, what I mean is when you see a social problem, you financialize, you privatize, and militarize. You get mass incarceration on the one hand, privatized schools. I know Sister Diane Rabbit's one of the great prophetic voices of our time in this regard. We'll talk about this later. And then you militarize, which is to say, drop bombs on 7 Muslim countries and then wonder why Muslims are upset. So, or you drop bombs on innocent children with U.S. drones and then wonder why the gangsters, the fascists coming out of the Muslim world are organizing. And of course, we got to be anti-fascist across the board. But this is going to be the most trying of times in our lifetime. There's no doubt about it. And at 63 years old, I am thoroughly fortified for this fight. I'll tell you that.
Well, given the people who voted for Trump, and continuing with what you said, many have questioned how Trump, who after all is a billionaire born into a wealthy family, how did he become a working class hero so widely perceived among the people who voted for him as someone outside of the American economic and political elite class?
Well, a significant number of those who voted for Trump were actually working people, middle-class people who are looking for a way out, given the fact that they're losers under neoliberal globalization. And they tilted toward Bernie Sanders, but the Democratic Party and its neoliberal regime marginalized him and us. And so the only alternative is this pseudo-populist billionaire with these narcissistic sensibilities and fascist, neo-fascist proclivities. And he presented himself as caring for their situation. And so that economic insecurity, that economic neglect is very real. There's no doubt about that. And it's disproportionately white brothers and sisters, but they are suffering. And it was a cry of the heart. Unfortunately, given the right-wing populist and authoritarian orientation of Trump, he uses that kind of anguish to scapegoat Mexicans, Muslims, and others, rather than confront the most powerful. 21% of those who voted for Trump do not like him, but they feel as if they had no alternative. And we have to keep in mind 42% of our fellow citizens didn't go to the polls at all. They've already given up on the system, you see. And so the system itself now is in such a chronic crisis. And we had said before the election that Trump would be a neo-fascist catastrophe. And it's very clear from his picks that he's moving in that direction.
Make poverty a priority in the national house and make it a priority in the world house. So that Latin America, Asia, Africa, every corner of the globe, poor people's humanity is accented in their capacities. Abilities are accented in such a way that you can see their self-development and their self-realization. Their voices are heard at the highest level. But it means what? Righteous indignation. Anger channeled through love and justice, not bigotry and revenge, but they'll never be changed given oligarchic rule if you don't get mad with love and courage and be willing to live and die for something bigger than you.